The night air hung heavy over the suburban streets of Evanston, Illinois, pierced only by the distant wail of sirens and the intermittent flicker of police cruiser lights reflecting off rain-slicked pavement. Inside a modest two-story home on Maplewood Drive, the chaos that unfolded moments earlier had left a somber imprint on the once quiet neighborhood. At the center of this turmoil stood Jason Miller, a 16-year-old whose youthful frame belied the violent episode that had just transpired within these walls. Before we dive deeper into this gripping story, please take a moment to subscribe and hit that like button. We'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below on what you think about the complexities of juvenile justice. Your engagement helps us continue to bring you these compelling narratives. It was shortly after 11 p.m. when law enforcement officers arrived in response to a 911 call reporting a domestic disturbance. The dispatcher's voice, calm yet urgent, had relayed a message from a distressed neighbor who heard raised voices escalating into the unmistakable sounds of a physical altercation. Detective Laura Simmons, the lead investigator assigned to the case, would later recount the scene she encountered upon entry, a scene that would serve as the grim prologue to a complex and troubling legal saga. Jason sat on the living room floor, his hands trembling, eyes darting nervously toward the paramedics tending to his stepfather, Robert Miller, who lay slumped against the staircase, blood seeping through his shirt from multiple lacerations. The teenager's disheveled appearance and visible agitation suggested a volatility that had perhaps been simmering beneath the surface for some time. His mother, Mary Ann Miller, stood nearby, her face pale and etched with exhaustion, clutching a disorganized bundle of clothes, her eyes betraying a mixture of disbelief and sorrow. The paramedics worked swiftly, stabilizing Robert Miller before rushing him to the nearby Evanston Hospital, where he would be admitted with critical injuries including deep knife wounds to the torso. The gravity of the situation was immediately apparent. What had been initially described as a domestic dispute had escalated into a violent assault with potentially life-threatening consequences. Detective Simmons, methodical and composed, began her preliminary inquiry on site, carefully piecing together the fragmented narratives from the occupants and neighbors. Jason's account was tentative, at times contradictory, and punctuated by moments of silence that conveyed more than words could. According to the teenager, the altercation had erupted suddenly, following a heated argument over household tensions that had been mounting for months. He claimed his actions were defensive, a desperate response to an aggressive advance by his stepfather. Yet the physical evidence and witness testimony suggested a more complicated dynamic. Neighbors reported hearing raised voices escalating into screams and the unmistakable sound of a struggle. One witness, who asked to remain anonymous, described seeing Jason exit the house shortly after the incident, his hand stained with blood, appearing visibly shaken. Another recounted hearing a chilling plea for help from Mary Ann Miller. The conflicting accounts created an immediate challenge for investigators seeking to establish a coherent timeline and motive. The atmosphere within the Miller household was fraught with tension long before that night. Sources familiar with the family revealed a pattern of discord and instability, with Robert Miller's disciplinarian approach clashing with Jason's growing resentment. Family, friends, and school personnel had observed a gradual withdrawal in the teenager's behavior, noting increasing episodes of anger and defiance. The incident that culminated in the violent confrontation was not an isolated event, but rather the apex of a series of escalating conflicts. Law enforcement officials were meticulous in their collection of forensic evidence. The knife, a serrated kitchen blade wiped clean, but for trace amounts of blood, was recovered from the scene. Photographs documented the disarray of the living room, furniture overturned, broken glass, and smeared bloodstains marking the path of the struggle. These elements, combined with Jason's fluctuating statements, intensified the scrutiny surrounding his role in the incident. Throughout the night, the teenager was held in a secured room at the police precinct, his demeanor oscillating between defiance and despair. When questioned, Jason maintained a guarded silence at first, eventually offering fragmented explanations that hinted at a complex psychological turmoil. He described a home environment imbued with conflict, where moments of peace were fleeting and overshadowed by an undercurrent of fear and frustration. "It just got out of hand," he remarked quietly, eyes downcast. "I didn't mean for it to go this far." The weight of the arrest settled heavily on Jason, who was formally charged later that evening with aggravated assault. The decision to detain a juvenile on such serious charges was met with a mixture of concern and urgency among legal authorities, cognizant of the implications a life-altering sentence could impose on a youth still navigating the precarious transition to adulthood. As dawn broke over Evanston, the neighborhood stirred with whispers and speculation. The Miller residence, once a symbol of suburban normalcy, was now cordoned off with police tape, a stark reminder of the violence that had shattered the quiet street. Community members grappled with the unsettling reality that such a grievous incident had unfolded so close to home, challenging perceptions of safety and trust. The arrest of Jason Miller marked the beginning of an arduous journey through the criminal justice system, one that would encompass intense scrutiny, psychological evaluation, and ultimately a contentious trial. The initial moments captured by the responding officers and investigators laid bare the raw and complicated nature of juvenile crime, a domain where legal accountability intersects with questions of mental health, familial dysfunction, and societal responsibility. Within the confines of the interrogation room, Detective Simmons pressed for clarity, her voice steady, yet empathetic. "Jason, we need to understand exactly what happened tonight," she urged. The teenager's gaze flickered, betraying a mixture of confusion and vulnerability. "I just wanted it to stop," he whispered, the phrase heavy with unspoken history. The stark reality that Jason faced was underscored by the immediate and irrevocable consequences of his actions. The law regarded the use of a deadly weapon with grave seriousness, and the path ahead promised to be fraught with legal complexities and emotional reckonings. The events of that night, seared into the memories of all involved, would serve as the foundation for a case that questioned the boundaries of juvenile culpability and the potential for redemption. Meanwhile, the medical prognosis for Robert Miller remained guarded. The critical nature of his injuries underscored the severity of the assault, amplifying the stakes for the prosecution. The narrative that unfolded was not merely about a single violent act, but about the unraveling of a family caught in the crosshairs of trauma and fractured relationships. As the investigation progressed, law enforcement officials would delve deeper into the family's history, seeking to uncover the antecedents of the conflict and assess the psychological state of the juvenile offender. The initial chaos of that late autumn night belied the intricate web of factors that would come to define the case, factors that intertwined legal mandates with a nuanced understanding of adolescent development and mental health. The arrest of a 16-year-old for a violent attack within his own home sent ripples beyond the immediate community, igniting conversations about the vulnerabilities of youth caught in turbulent domestic environments. For Jason Miller, the journey from a troubled teenager to a defendant facing severe charges had begun in a single chaotic moment, one that would irrevocably alter the trajectory of his life. In the cool dawn light, the street outside the Miller home remained silent, yet the echoes of that night persisted, a somber testament to the fragility of familial bonds and the devastating consequences when those bonds fracture beyond repair. The legal process loomed large, a formidable arena where the future of a juvenile offender would be contested with unwavering intensity. Detective Laura Simmons approached the Miller case with a methodical precision born of years investigating complex domestic incidents. The initial chaos of the night had given way to a meticulous examination of evidence, witness accounts, and forensic data, all of which painted a multifaceted picture that defied simple categorization. From the outset, the investigation was marked by contradictions and ambiguities that demanded careful scrutiny. Upon arriving at the scene, Simmons had noted the disarray within the Miller household: overturned furniture, shattered glass, and blood spatter patterns that suggested a violent struggle. Yet, as she began canvassing neighbors and family members, the narrative became less clear. Jason Miller's claim of self-defense met with skeptical eyes as witnesses offered conflicting descriptions of the altercation's sequence and severity. One neighbor, a middle-aged woman living 2 houses down, reported hearing loud arguing, followed by sounds of something heavy hitting the floor, and then a sudden silence before the arrival of emergency responders. Her statement was corroborated partially by another resident who heard a young male voice shouting, "Stop, please!" a plea that resonated ominously with the events that unfolded inside the Miller home. However, neither witness had seen the actual confrontation, leaving gaps in the timeline. Detective Simmons found herself confronted with discrepancies in Jason's recounting of the night. Initially, he asserted that his stepfather had lunged at him aggressively, prompting a defensive reaction. Later, under further questioning, the teenager's story shifted, acknowledging moments of provocation but maintaining that he had not intended to inflict serious harm. His evasiveness raised red flags for the investigator, who was trained to detect subtle signs of deception or psychological distress. The physical evidence provided additional layers of complexity. Forensic teams analyzed the blood patterns and the recovered serrated knife, noting that the wounds inflicted on Robert Miller were multiple and deep, consistent with repeated strikes. The placement and angle of the injuries suggested a close-quarters struggle rather than a single defensive blow. These findings challenged Jason's narrative and indicated a more aggressive use of force than initially claimed. Compounding the difficulty was the discovery of text messages on Jason's cell phone, retrieved under warrant. Among the digital correspondence were exchanges with peers that hinted at escalating tensions at home, but also contained alarming references to plans and emotions that suggested premeditation. One message read, "I can't take this anymore," while another cryptically stated, I'm ready to fight back. These communications introduced the possibility that the incident was not entirely spontaneous, but perhaps the culmination of simmering resentment. The inconsistencies extended to Mary Ann Miller's statements as well. The teenager's mother, grappling with her own struggles, including documented issues with substance abuse, provided an account that was at times contradictory and fragmented. Her testimony spoke of a household under strain, marked by frequent arguments and an underlying sense of fear, but she vacillated when pressed about the specifics of the night's events. Her credibility was thus weighed carefully against other sources. Detective Simmons and her team undertook a thorough review of the home's security system footage, which had captured blurred and partial images of movements inside the residence during the critical hours. While the video did not offer definitive proof of the sequence of actions, it confirmed the timing of key moments and showed Jason exiting the house with visible bloodstains on his clothing, a fact that corroborated witness observations and solidified the timeline of the assault. The investigation also unearthed prior reports involving Jason, including disciplinary actions at school for behavioral infractions and previous calls to Child Protective Services related to domestic disturbances. These records painted a portrait of a youth caught in a cycle of conflict and instability, factors that would later influence psychological evaluations and legal arguments. Throughout the process, Detective Simmons maintained an awareness of the delicate balance required when dealing with juvenile offenders. The law stipulated different considerations for minors, especially in cases involving family violence. Nonetheless, the seriousness of the injuries sustained by Robert Miller necessitated a rigorous pursuit of justice, even as the investigative team sought to understand the underlying dynamics. Interviews with school counselors and social workers revealed a pattern of emotional disengagement and escalating aggression in Jason's recent behavior. Teachers described a once outgoing student who had become increasingly withdrawn, prone to outbursts, and resistant to authority. These behavioral shifts aligned with the observations from family members and added psychological dimensions to the investigation. As the evidence accumulated, a portrait emerged of a troubled adolescent grappling with complex familial relationships and internal turmoil, yet the question remained, did the physical evidence and testimonial accounts support Jason's claim of self-defense, or did they depict an attack driven by deeper resentments and a loss of control? Detective Simmons convened with forensic experts and legal advisors to evaluate the strength of the case. The knife wound's severity and multiplicity pointed toward a violent encounter beyond a simple defensive act, while the incriminating text messages suggested pre-existing emotional distress that might have motivated the assault. However, the absence of direct visual evidence of the confrontation left room for interpretation. The detective's notes reflected this ambiguity. The appellant's statements fluctuate between remorse and defiance, she recorded. The physical evidence indicates significant aggression. Witness accounts are incomplete and partially contradictory. Further psychological assessment is essential to contextualize the behavior observed. In parallel, the medical team's reports on Robert Miller underscored the gravity of the attack. The victim had undergone emergency surgery to address multiple stab wounds, some of which had compromised vital organs. The prognosis was cautiously optimistic, but the trauma inflicted was undeniable. This medical reality added weight to the prosecution's case and framed the legal stakes in stark terms. The tension between the legal imperatives and the psychological complexities of the juvenile offender set the stage for a multifaceted investigation. Detective Simmons recognized that the case transcended the immediate incident, touching on broader issues of adolescent mental health, familial dysfunction, and the challenges of adjudicating violent juvenile crimes. In the days following the initial inquiry, the detective expanded her interviews, including discussions with extended family members and community figures who provided insights into the Miller household's dynamics. These accounts painted a picture of a family struggling under the weight of economic hardship, addiction, and emotional fragmentation, elements that contextualized but did not excuse the violent outcome. Throughout this phase of the investigation, Jason's demeanor remained guarded. In subsequent custodial interviews, his responses revealed a conflicted psyche, oscillating between attempts to rationalize his actions and moments of profound vulnerability. "I didn't want to hurt him that badly," he confided in one session, "but I felt trapped. I thought if I didn't fight back, it would never stop." Detective Simmons documented these exchanges with clinical detachment, aware that such statements would later bear significant influence in both psychological evaluations and courtroom proceedings. The interplay between factual evidence and the appellant's mental state was becoming increasingly pivotal. Moreover, the discovery of the text messages introduced an evidentiary complexity that required careful legal navigation. The messages hinted at intentionality that contradicted claims of impulsive self-defense. Prosecutors seized upon these communications to argue for premeditation, while defense attorneys contested their interpretation, emphasizing the emotional distress underlying the texts. The investigative phase culminated in a comprehensive dossier compiled by Detective Simmons, integrating forensic analysis, witness statements, medical reports, and digital evidence. This dossier would form the backbone of the prosecution's case, yet it also highlighted unresolved questions about motive, mental health, and the appropriate legal response to juvenile violence. As the case progressed toward formal charges, the investigative team prepared to transition from fact-finding to legal strategy. Detective Simmons remained acutely aware that the complexities uncovered in this phase would reverberate throughout the ensuing trial, shaping arguments, testimonies, and ultimately the fate of the teenager at its center. In the quiet moments after long days of inquiry, the detective reflected on the broader implications. The Miller case was emblematic of the challenges confronting the juvenile justice system, a domain where the lines between victim and perpetrator blur, and where the law must grapple with the vulnerabilities of youth amid serious allegations. The investigation's findings underscored that beneath the surface of a violent act lay a tangled web of psychological and social factors demanding nuanced understanding and measured judgment. The quiet streets of Evanston, with their tree-lined avenues and neatly maintained homes, belied a community grappling with undercurrents of tension that few outsiders could perceive. The Miller family, emblematic in many ways of the neighborhood's middle-class veneer, was at the epicenter of a private turmoil that would soon become public tragedy. As investigators and social workers delved deeper into the family's history, a portrait emerged, one marked by instability, strained relationships, and unspoken struggles. Jason Miller's upbringing, on the surface, appeared ordinary. Born to Mary Ann Miller in a modest two-bedroom house, his early years were characterized by typical childhood routines and school attendance at local public institutions. Yet beneath this facade lay fractures that would widen with time. Mary Ann, a woman in her late 30s, was known among acquaintances as warm but often distracted, a consequence, as revealed in social service reports, of her ongoing battle with substance abuse. Her intermittent periods of sobriety were punctuated by relapses that introduced volatility into the household atmosphere. The presence of Robert Miller, Jason's stepfather, added another layer of complexity to the family dynamic. A man in his mid-40s, Robert had entered the picture when Jason was 10, bringing with him a strict, authoritarian approach to parenting. While he held steady employment and was regarded in the neighborhood as responsible and reserved, within the home his demeanor was reportedly rigid and, at times, confrontational. Neighbors and family friends recounted episodes of discord that had, over the years, become a norm rather than an exception. The relationship between Jason and Robert was frequently described as strained, punctuated by sharp exchanges and disciplinary measures that some interpreted as harsh, especially given Jason's sensitive disposition. Reports from school counselors corroborated this, noting that Jason displayed signs of anxiety and withdrawal, attributes that seemed to intensify in the months leading up to the incident. The mother-son relationship was equally fraught. Mary Ann's struggle with addiction limited her capacity to provide consistent emotional support, leaving Jason often to navigate his challenges largely alone. Family members who attempted to intervene testified to the difficulties of maintaining cohesion amid the competing pressures of addiction, unemployment, and familial discord. Social service records revealed prior involvement with child protective agencies, triggered by reports of neglect and domestic disturbances. These interventions, while designed to provide support, often yielded mixed results, constrained by the family's resistance to sustained assistance and the systemic limitations of outreach programs. The cumulative effect was a household environment marked by unpredictability and tension, factors that investigators later identified as significant in understanding Jason's psychological state. School records offered further insight. Teachers remembered Jason as a bright student who initially engaged with peers and academic pursuits, but whose performance and demeanor deteriorated over time. Behavioral reports noted increasing absenteeism, episodes of aggression, and withdrawal from extracurricular activities. Counselors attempted to engage the teenager in support programs, but these endeavors met with limited success. Jason's growing isolation was evident, a symptom of his internal struggles and external pressures. Friends spoke cautiously, some expressing concern over Jason's mood swings and occasional outbursts. One close acquaintance recalled a conversation weeks before the incident, where Jason confided feelings of frustration and entrapment within his family situation. He said he felt like no one was listening, the friend recounted, that he was tired of always being blamed or misunderstood. This testimony underscored the emotional turbulence simmering beneath Jason's stoic exterior. Community leaders familiar with the Miller family described the home as emblematic of broader social challenges affecting similar households where economic constraints, addiction, and fractured relationships converged to create environments ripe for conflict. Local social workers emphasized the difficulty in breaking cycles of dysfunction, especially when compounded by inadequate access to mental health resources. The broader neighborhood context provided a backdrop to the family's struggles. Evanston, while generally regarded as stable and relatively affluent, contained pockets where socioeconomic disparities and hidden domestic issues persisted. The Miller household, situated in a middle-income bracket, was not exempt from these undercurrents. The incident involving Jason thus resonated beyond the immediate family, stirring conversations about community support systems and preventive interventions. Within the family, the tension had been escalating for months. Mary Ann's addiction relapses often precipitated arguments between her and Robert, with Jason caught in the crossfire. The teenager's attempts to assert autonomy and resist his stepfather's discipline were met with increasing rigidity, exacerbating the conflict. Psychological evaluations later noted that such patterns of familial discord are known to heighten adolescent stress and contribute to behavioral problems. The day preceding the confrontation was marked by a particularly volatile exchange, according to testimonies. Mary Ann recalled a confrontation between Jason and Robert that left the atmosphere thick with anger. Neighbors overheard raised voices and, in some cases, sounds suggestive of physical altercations. This buildup of tension set the stage for the tragic events that would soon follow. Psychological experts brought in during the investigation highlighted the impact of such an unstable environment on adolescent development. Chronic exposure to conflict, inconsistent parental attachment, and the stress of living with a parent struggling with addiction were identified as significant risk factors for emotional and behavioral dysregulation. Jason's behavioral changes, withdrawal, aggression, and mood swings, were consistent with these profiles. Moreover, the absence of a stable support network exacerbated Jason's vulnerability. Extended family involvement was limited, and community resources were underutilized or inaccessible. School interventions, while present, lacked the intensity or consistency required to effect meaningful change. This constellation of deficits left the teenager ill-equipped to cope with mounting pressures. The familial landscape was further complicated by Mary Ann's ambivalence toward intervention. Her own struggles often took precedence over addressing Jason's needs. Statements from social workers reflected a pattern of missed appointments and inconsistent engagement with support services, a factor that impeded efforts to stabilize the household. In the weeks following the incident, interviews with family members revealed layers of regret and unresolved conflict. Mary Ann expressed sorrow over the trajectory of events, but also a sense of helplessness. "I wanted to protect him," she said in a recorded statement, "but sometimes I didn't know how to keep us all safe." Robert, recovering from his injuries, remained largely silent, his perspective filtered through legal counsel. The Miller family's story was thus one of fractured relationships and unmet needs, a microcosm of the challenges faced by many families, where addiction, economic strain, and emotional turmoil intersect. This context would become central to the defense's argument in subsequent legal proceedings, aiming to frame Jason's actions within the broader psychosocial environment that shaped his behavior. As investigators compiled these insights, the community began to grapple with the implications. Conversations among neighbors, school officials, and social workers reflected a shared recognition of the systemic failures that allowed such a situation to escalate unchecked. Calls for expanded mental health services, addiction treatment, and family support programs gained momentum, highlighting the need for a more proactive approach to prevent similar tragedies. The Miller household's unraveling underscored how the veneer of normalcy can mask profound dysfunction. For Jason, these dynamics forged a crucible of emotional distress and conflict that would culminate in the violent confrontation with his stepfather. Understanding this background was essential, not to excuse the actions taken, but to contextualize the psychological and social forces that influenced a troubled adolescent's path. In the quiet moments of reflection, social workers and legal professionals alike acknowledged the daunting challenge posed by cases such as Jason's. The intersection of family dysfunction, mental health struggles, and juvenile delinquency demanded a nuanced approach, one that balanced accountability with compassion and recognized the potential for rehabilitation amid adversity. The Miller family's narrative, thus, was not merely a backdrop to a criminal investigation, but a critical component in the unfolding legal and psychological examination. It illuminated the profound impact of environment on youth behavior and raised urgent questions about society's responsibility to intervene before crisis points are reached. Within this framework, Jason Miller's trajectory from a conflicted child to a juvenile offender was refracted through the prism of familial and community failures. The accumulation of stressors, unmet needs, and fractured bonds set the stage for the tragic events that would come to define his adolescence and shape the legal battle ahead. In the months preceding the altercation that would irrevocably alter Jason Miller's life, those closest to him observed a marked transformation in his demeanor and emotional state, changes that foreshadowed the crisis to come. Once an outgoing and affable teenager, Jason had gradually withdrawn into himself, exhibiting a volatility that alarmed friends, teachers, and counselors alike. This shift was neither sudden nor isolated, but rather the culmination of mounting psychological strain exacerbated by the instability within his family environment. School officials were among the first to note the troubling signs. Counselors at Evanston High School documented a progressive decline in Jason's academic engagement and social interactions. His attendance became irregular, punctuated by unexplained absences that raised concern. When present, he demonstrated difficulty concentrating, his grades slipping in core subjects. Faculty reports characterized him as increasingly sullen and irritable, prone to outbursts that disrupted the classroom environment. One educator recalled a particularly tense episode in which Jason, provoked by a perceived slight, lashed out verbally at a peer, an incident swiftly de-escalated but indicative of his mounting frustration. Conversations with school counselors revealed a young person grappling with complex emotions. During a series of confidential sessions, Jason articulated feelings of isolation and anger, frequently citing his home life as a source of distress. "It's like living with a storm that never ends," he confided in one meeting, his voice laden with exhaustion. The counselors endeavored to provide support, offering coping strategies and referrals to external mental health services, yet their efforts were hampered by Jason's ambivalence and periodic resistance. Peers, too, sensed the change. Friends described a gradual distancing, noting that Jason, who had once sought camaraderie, now preferred solitude. Attempts to engage him in social activities were often met with indifference or outright rejection. Some spoke of his mood swings, moments of apparent calm giving way to sudden irritability or despondence. One close friend recounted a conversation shortly before the incident in which Jason expressed feelings of hopelessness. He said he felt like nobody understood him, like he was invisible, the friend recalled. This testimony illuminated the deepening emotional chasm isolating the teenager. Behavioral issues became increasingly apparent outside the academic setting as well. Reports surfaced of minor altercations in the community, some involving verbal threats or physical intimidation, while none escalated to serious legal infractions. These incidents signaled a growing pattern of aggression and poor impulse control. Such behaviors are often symptomatic of underlying psychological distress, particularly in adolescents contending with adverse environments. The family's internal dynamics further complicated the situation. Marianne Miller's struggles with addiction and Robert Miller's authoritarian parenting style created an atmosphere rife with conflict. Jason's frustration with his stepfather's strictness manifested not only in verbal defiance, but also in withdrawal and emotional suppression. Psychological theories suggest that adolescents in such circumstances may oscillate between rebellion and retreat, both serving as maladaptive coping mechanisms. Mental health professionals later involved in Jason's case identified signs consistent with depression and anxiety disorders, conditions frequently underdiagnosed in youths experiencing chronic familial stress. The lack of consistent therapeutic intervention allowed these conditions to intensify, eroding Jason's resilience and capacity for self-regulation. The cumulative effect was a teenager increasingly vulnerable to impulsive and potentially destructive behavior. School counselors expressed frustration at systemic barriers that impeded timely and effective support. Limited resources, stigma surrounding mental health, and Jason's own reluctance to engage created a challenging environment for intervention. Despite outreach efforts, the teenager remained largely isolated, a factor that would prove critical in the lead-up to the violent episode. Community outreach programs and youth services, while available, had limited penetration into Jason's life. The absence of a strong support network beyond the immediate family left him without reliable adult mentors or safe spaces to process his emotions. This lack of external scaffolding is recognized in psychological literature as a significant risk factor for adolescent maladjustment and behavioral issues. In conversations with law enforcement following his arrest, Jason exhibited a conflicted emotional state. His initial defiance gradually gave way to moments of vulnerability as he reflected on the pressures he faced. "I just wanted to be heard," he stated during one recorded interview, his voice strained. "I felt trapped, like everything was closing in." Such admissions underscored the psychological burdens that had accumulated, contributing to the eventual breakdown. The interplay of these factors, academic decline, social withdrawal, family conflict, and unmet mental health needs, painted a complex picture of a youth on the precipice. Jason's behavioral changes were not merely acts of rebellion, but manifestations of deeper emotional turmoil shaped by his environment. This understanding would later inform the psychological evaluations central to his defense. Interviews with social workers involved in the case highlighted systemic challenges in addressing adolescent mental health within vulnerable populations. Resource limitations, gaps in coordination between agencies, and the stigma attached to seeking help often resulted in delayed or insufficient intervention. Jason's case exemplified the consequences of these systemic shortcomings. The psychological profile that emerged from assessments conducted after the incident revealed a constellation of symptoms consistent with trauma and chronic stress. Experts noted evidence of mood instability, difficulty with emotional regulation, and impaired judgment, factors that contributed to the escalation of conflict within the family setting. These findings underscored the need for a nuanced approach to juvenile justice, recognizing the interplay between mental health and behavior. Throughout the pre-trial period, Jason's defense team emphasized the significance of his emotional struggles and behavioral history. They argued that these issues were integral to understanding the context of the incident and should be considered in determining culpability and sentencing. The notion of a troubled youth acting under duress and impaired judgment formed a cornerstone of their strategy. Prosecutors, while acknowledging the psychological complexities, underscored the severity of the assault and the responsibility inherent in wielding a deadly weapon. They contended that the appellant's behavioral changes did not absolve him of accountability, particularly given the extent of harm inflicted on Robert Miller. The courtroom would become the arena where these competing narratives clashed. In private moments, Jason's demeanor reflected the weight of his circumstances. Observers noted fluctuations between moments of composure and visible distress, a testament to the internal conflict he grappled with. His youthful face, once vibrant with promise, now bore the lines of hardship and uncertainty. The trajectory from an outgoing adolescent to a withdrawn and angry youth was neither linear nor irreversible. Yet, the absence of timely, effective intervention allowed the downward spiral to continue unchecked. Jason's behavioral changes were a cry for help, a signal unheeded by a system strained in its capacity to respond. As the courtroom proceedings loomed, the psychological narrative surrounding Jason Miller would become central to debates about rehabilitation, justice, and the capacity for reform. His emotional struggles and behavioral shifts, once private matters, were now public discourse, shaping perceptions of the juvenile offender and informing the legal process that would decide his fate. The evidentiary landscape of the Miller case took a decisive turn as investigators and forensic analysts sifted through the physical and digital artifacts left in the wake of the violent incident. Central to the prosecution's argument was the knife used in the attack, a serrated kitchen blade recovered from the scene with blood traces matching both victim and appellant. The weapon, emblematic of the brutal confrontation, became a focal point in both the investigative and legal phases, embodying the severity of the assault and the contentious nature of Jason Miller's defense. Forensic experts meticulously examined the knife, documenting its dimensions, serration pattern, and the distribution of blood residues. The blade measured approximately 8 inches, with a distinctive serrated edge capable of inflicting deep lacerations. Analysis determined that the bloodstains were consistent with fresh wounds, corroborating the timeline established by eyewitnesses and medical reports. The presence of both Robert Miller's and Jason's blood suggested a close-quarter struggle, reinforcing the narrative of a violent altercation rather than a singular defensive act. Simultaneously, Security footage from the Miller residence's exterior surveillance system offered partial but critical visual data. The grainy, low-resolution recordings captured intermittent movements during the late evening hours of the incident. While the internal confrontation was obscured from view, the footage documented Jason's exit from the home shortly after the assault, his clothing visibly stained with blood. These images, though limited in scope, aligned with eyewitness accounts and the forensic timeline, lending credence to the sequence of events as reconstructed by investigators. Perhaps most revealing was the digital evidence extracted from Jason's cell phone. Under warrant, law enforcement accessed text message exchanges that illuminated the psychological and emotional underpinnings preceding the assault. Among the messages were expressions of frustration, fear, and a perceived lack of agency within the family dynamic. One message read, "I'm done being pushed around," while another ominously stated, "If it comes to a fight, I won't back down." These communications, time-stamped within days of the incident, suggested a buildup of tension and a possible anticipation of conflict. Defense counsel challenged the interpretation of these messages, arguing that they reflected emotional distress rather than premeditated intent to harm. They posited that the texts were cries for help, manifestations of a teenager overwhelmed by familial dysfunction rather than concrete evidence of planning a violent act. Prosecutors countered, emphasizing that the language indicated a readiness to engage in confrontation, undermining claims of spontaneity or self-defense. The legal teams also scrutinized the security footage for contextual clues. While the recordings did not capture the altercation itself, the timing and Jason's demeanor upon leaving the house were analyzed closely. The blood on his clothing was interpreted by the prosecution as evidence of his active participation in the assault, while the defense suggested it was consistent with defensive wounds sustained during the struggle. Further complicating the evidentiary picture was the absence of direct eyewitness testimony to the immediate physical confrontation. Neighbors heard raised voices and sounds of distress, but did not witness the attack, necessitating reliance on circumstantial evidence and forensic analysis. This nuance introduced challenges in establishing clear intent and the exact sequence of actions, factors critical to the adjudication of charges. The knife itself became a symbol within courtroom proceedings. Prosecutors highlighted its potential lethality, underscoring the danger posed by wielding such a weapon, especially within a domestic environment. They argued that the appellant's use of the knife demonstrated an escalation beyond self-defense into aggressive assault, a claim supported by the multiplicity and severity of the victim's wounds. In response, the defense emphasized Jason's youth and psychological state, contending that the teenager's actions were reactive, fueled by fear and emotional turmoil rather than calculated aggression. Expert witnesses testified to the impulsivity characteristic of adolescent behavior, particularly under duress, and the difficulty in regulating responses to perceived threats within a volatile household. The knife's forensic analysis extended to the examination of fingerprints and DNA evidence. While Jason's prints were found on the handle, as expected, no foreign prints were detected, ruling out third-party involvement. Additionally, the presence of Mary Ann Miller's DNA in minor traces was noted but deemed incidental, likely from handling the weapon prior or post-incident. These findings reinforce the narrative centered on the appellant and the victim. The prosecution also presented medical reports detailing the nature of the stab wounds, multiple punctures and lacerations to the torso and arms, some inflicting critical injury to internal organs. These injuries were consistent with repeated forceful strikes rather than a singular defensive act, bolstering the argument for intentional harm. In the digital realm, the extraction of text messages extended beyond direct communications to encompass social media interactions and search history. Among these were queries related to legal consequences of assault, juvenile detention protocols, and appeals processes. These digital footprints suggested a degree of awareness and engagement with the potential ramifications of violent behavior, complicating claims of impulsivity. Jason's defense team sought to contextualize these findings within a framework of adolescent cognitive development, emphasizing that teenagers often grapple with understanding consequences and may engage in exploratory behaviors without full appreciation of legal outcomes. Psychological experts cited in court elaborated on the developmental limitations in impulse control and foresight, typical in individuals of Jason's age. The knife and digital evidence, when combined, presented a compelling narrative for both sides. The prosecution painted a picture of a violent attack, premeditated or at least deliberate, with serious consequences for the victim. The defense countered with a portrayal of a troubled youth overwhelmed by circumstances whose actions, while regrettable, were not fully intentional or malicious. Throughout the investigative phase, law enforcement officers documented the chain of custody for the knife meticulously, ensuring its integrity as evidence. Photographs of the weapon in situ, laboratory reports, and testimonies from forensic analysts were prepared for presentation in court, underscoring the evidentiary weight assigned to this physical artifact. Similarly, digital forensic specialists testified to the methods used in extracting and authenticating the text messages and other data. The prosecution sought to establish the reliability and relevance of this evidence, anticipating its impact on jurors' perceptions of intent and premeditation. During pretrial depositions, the defense questioned the interpretation of the digital communications, suggesting that selected messages were taken out of emotional context and did not represent a clear plan to commit violence. They argued for a holistic understanding of Jason's psychological state, incorporating stress, fear, and confusion. The knife's presentation in court was a moment of palpable tension. Prosecutors displayed the weapon to the jury, detailing its characteristics and the injuries inflicted. The gravity of the physical evidence was undeniable, eliciting a somber silence as jurors absorbed the implications. Conversely, the defense introduced psychological assessments highlighting Jason's impaired judgment and emotional instability at the time of the incident. They contended that the knife, while used in the assault, was wielded in a state of panic and desperation rather than calculated aggression. Amid these evidentiary debates, the discovery of Jason's plans to appeal was unveiled, primarily through intercepted communications post-arrest. Texts and recorded statements indicated his belief in the possibility of overturning charges, grounded in his conviction of innocence or mitigating circumstances. This revelation added a layer of complexity to the case, suggesting a level of legal awareness inconsistent with a wholly impulsive offender. The prosecution interpreted this as evidence of consciousness of guilt, while the defense framed it as a natural response to fear and confusion in the face of serious accusations. As the trial approached, the knife and accompanying digital evidence stood as pillars upon which much of the case would rest. Their analysis and interpretation would shape not only the legal arguments, but also the broader discourse on juvenile culpability, intent, and the intersection of psychological distress with criminal behavior. In the end, these critical pieces of evidence illuminated the multifaceted nature of the incident, a violent act steeped in familial conflict, adolescent turmoil, and the stark realities of the justice system's endeavor to discern truth amid complexity. Psychological experts called upon to assess Jason Miller's mental state converged on a consensus that his actions were profoundly influenced by a complex interplay of trauma, familial instability, and adolescent developmental challenges. The evaluations, conducted over multiple sessions, sought to illuminate the undercurrents shaping the behavior of a juvenile offender thrust into a violent confrontation within his own home, a scenario fraught with both legal and psychological intricacies. Dr. Helen Ramirez, a clinical psychologist specializing in adolescent trauma, provided a comprehensive analysis of Jason's profile. Her assessment underscored the pervasive impact of chronic exposure to domestic conflict and parental substance abuse on the teenager's emotional regulation and decision-making capacities. Jason's psychological functioning is emblematic of youths subjected to prolonged environmental stressors, she testified. Such conditions often precipitate heightened anxiety, impaired impulse control, and difficulties in processing and responding to perceived threats. The evaluation revealed symptoms consistent with post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD, including hypervigilance, emotional numbing, and recurrent intrusive thoughts related to familial discord. These manifestations, Dr. Ramirez explained, are not uncommon in adolescents navigating volatile home environments, where unpredictability and fear become normative elements of daily life. The chronicity of trauma alters neural pathways involved in fear response and executive functioning, she elaborated, which can lead to reactive aggression when the individual perceives imminent danger. Complementing this perspective, Dr. Samuel Lee, a forensic psychiatrist, delved into the neurodevelopmental aspects pertinent to adolescent behavior. Drawing upon empirical research, he highlighted the ongoing maturation of the prefrontal cortex, the brain region responsible for judgment, impulse control, and risk assessment, well into the mid-20s. At 16, Jason's cognitive and emotional regulation systems were still under development, Dr. Lee explained. This neurobiological immaturity can manifest as difficulty in foreseeing the consequences of one's actions, particularly in high-stress situations. Dr. Lee's testimony emphasized that juveniles' propensity for impulsivity and susceptibility to emotional overwhelm must be factored into both legal responsibility and sentencing considerations. He cautioned against equating adolescent decision-making with adult standards, advocating for a justice approach informed by developmental science. Further psychological evaluation addressed Jason's coping mechanisms in response to his unstable family milieu. The absence of consistent parental support and exposure to substance misuse contributed to feelings of abandonment and mistrust, impairing his capacity to seek or accept help. This emotional isolation, combined with social withdrawal observed in school settings, exacerbated his vulnerability to maladaptive behaviors. The sociological dimension of Jason's predicament was explored by Dr. Karen Mitchell, a social psychologist specializing in family systems and youth behavior. Dr. Mitchell contextualized Jason's actions within the framework of systemic dysfunction, emphasizing how interrelated factors, economic hardship, addiction, and familial conflict, create an environment that undermines healthy adolescent development. Jason's behavior cannot be disentangled from the social conditions enveloping him, she asserted. The cumulative stressors erode resilience and foster a sense of entrapment. Her analysis underscored the role of social support networks, or the lack thereof, in mediating adolescent outcomes. Jason's limited access to effective community resources and mentorship heightened his susceptibility to emotional dysregulation and conflict escalation. Dr. Mitchell recommended that interventions addressing juvenile offenders must extend beyond individual treatment to encompass family and community systems. The psychological evaluations also incorporated standardized testing to assess Jason's cognitive functioning, emotional state, and risk factors for future behavioral issues. Results indicated moderate levels of depression and anxiety, consistent with clinical observations. Additionally, assessments pointed to deficits in problem-solving skills and emotional awareness, impairments that likely contributed to his inability to de-escalate the confrontation with his stepfather. Defense attorneys leveraged these expert testimonies to argue for leniency and rehabilitation-focused sentencing. They contended that Jason's actions, while serious, were a reflection of impaired judgment within a context of overwhelming psychosocial stress. The defense posited that punitive measures without therapeutic intervention would fail to address the root causes of the violence and risk perpetuating a cycle of criminality. Prosecutors, while acknowledging the psychological complexities, emphasized the necessity of accountability for violent offenses, particularly those resulting in significant harm. They argued that mental health considerations should be balanced against the severity of the crime and the rights of victims. This tension between rehabilitation and retribution became a central theme in courtroom deliberations. The psychological insights also informed discussions around the appellant's capacity for change. Experts expressed cautious optimism regarding Jason's potential for rehabilitation, contingent upon access to comprehensive mental health services, stable living conditions, and supportive interventions. The recognition of adolescent neuroplasticity, the brain's ability to adapt and rewire, offered a scientific basis for hope, albeit tempered by the realities of the juvenile justice system. In addition to individual assessments, the expert panel examined the broader implications of trauma and mental health in juvenile offenders. They highlighted the systemic challenges in identifying and addressing psychological distress among at-risk youth, noting that many remain undiagnosed or untreated until involvement with the criminal justice system. This gap, they argued, necessitates improved screening, early intervention, and integrated services. The testimonies underscored the importance of trauma-informed approaches within legal proceedings, advocating for frameworks that recognize the interplay between environmental adversity and behavioral outcomes. Such paradigms challenge traditional punitive models, promoting instead a nuanced understanding of culpability that incorporates developmental and psychological factors. Throughout the trial, the juxtaposition of Jason's clinical profile with the legal criteria for culpability provoked intense debate. Judges and jurors were confronted with reconciling the gravity of the offense with the mitigating influence of psychological impairment. The case exemplified the complexities inherent in adjudicating juvenile violence, where the boundaries between accountability and compassion are often blurred. The psychological evaluation process itself was taxing for Jason, who grappled with the invasive nature of assessments and the emotional weight of confronting his experiences. Observers noted moments of visible distress during testing sessions, reflecting the enduring impact of trauma. These reactions lent a human dimension to the clinical data, reminding all present of the personal cost behind the legal abstractions. In summation, the psychological and sociological analyses presented in the Miller case illuminated the multifaceted nature of juvenile offending. They highlighted how trauma, family dysfunction, neurodevelopmental immaturity, and social context converge to shape behavior, complicating simplistic notions of guilt and punishment. The expert testimonies called for a justice system attuned to these realities, capable of balancing societal protection with the rehabilitative needs of vulnerable youth. This nuanced understanding would prove pivotal as the trial progressed, influencing defense strategies, prosecutorial responses, and ultimately, the judicial determination of Jason Miller's fate within the juvenile justice framework. The courtroom filled with a tense anticipation as the trial of Jason Miller commenced. The 16-year-old at the center of the proceedings, embodying the fraught intersection of juvenile justice, psychological complexity, and societal expectations. From the outset, the atmosphere was charged with the gravity of the charges, aggravated assault with a deadly weapon, and the profound implications that a verdict would have on the teenager's future. Jason entered the courtroom with a measured composure that belied the turmoil beneath. His eyes, though steady, reflected the weight of impending judgment. Accompanied by his legal defense team, he sat quietly, occasionally exchanging subdued glances with family members who filled the gallery. The prosecution, poised and resolute, prepared to present a case predicated on the severity of the assault and the evidence amassed during the investigation. The defense opened with a narrative aimed at humanizing the appellant, emphasizing his youth, psychological vulnerabilities, and tumultuous family background. Attorney Michael Reynolds articulated a plea for understanding, framing Jason's actions within the context of a teenager overwhelmed by chronic trauma and emotional instability. We ask the court to consider not only the act but the actor, a young man shaped by circumstances beyond his control, Reynolds urged, his voice measured but impassioned. Central to the defense's strategy was the argument that Jason's behavior was reactive rather than premeditated, a manifestation of impaired judgment stemming from his psychological state. They introduced expert testimony detailing the adolescent brain's developmental limitations and the impact of prolonged exposure to familial conflict and instability. These testimonies aimed to mitigate culpability by illustrating that Jason's capacity for reasoned decision-making was compromised. The prosecution, led by Assistant State's Attorney Karen Mitchell, countered with a stark portrayal of the assault's brutality and its consequences. Mitchell underscored the severity of Robert Miller's injuries and the lasting trauma inflicted upon the victim and his family. While we acknowledge the appellant's age, we cannot overlook the grave harm caused by his actions, Mitchell asserted. The law must hold accountable those who wield violence, regardless of background. Witness testimonies formed the backbone of the trial's evidentiary phase. First to testify was Detective Laura Simmons, whose detailed account of the crime scene, the initial investigation, and the collection of forensic evidence underscored the calculated nature of the assault. Her testimony included descriptions of the blood patterns, the recovered knife, and the security footage capturing Jason's departure from the home. Simmons's precise and clinical delivery lent a factual weight to the prosecution's narrative. Medical professionals followed, providing harrowing details of the victim's injuries and the emergency interventions required. The attending surgeon recounted the critical nature of Robert Miller's wounds, emphasizing that survival hinged on rapid and complex surgical procedures. These testimonies reinforced the physical and emotional toll exacted by the assault. The court then heard from school counselors and social workers who painted a picture of Jason's behavioral changes and emotional struggles. Their testimonies aligned with the defense's narrative, highlighting the teenager's withdrawal, mood swings, and difficulty coping with familial stress. These accounts sought to contextualize Jason's actions within a broader psychosocial framework. Perhaps most poignant was the testimony of Jason himself, who took the stand with a mixture of resolve and vulnerability. When questioned by his attorney, he spoke candidly about the pressures he faced at home, the fear and frustration that accumulated over time, and the moment when events spiraled out of control. "I never wanted to hurt him that badly," Jason admitted, voice wavering. "I just wanted it to stop." Cross-examination by the prosecution focused on inconsistencies in Jason's statements and the content of his digital communications, including text messages that suggested forethought regarding confrontation. The probing questions sought to challenge the defense's portrayal of impulsivity and psychological impairment, emphasizing the appellant's awareness of potential consequences. Expert witnesses in psychology and psychiatry were called to elaborate on Jason's mental health evaluations. Defense experts reiterated the developmental immaturity and trauma-induced impairments affecting the teenager, advocating for leniency and rehabilitation. Conversely, prosecution experts acknowledged these factors but maintained that they did not absolve Jason of responsibility for a violent act that could have resulted in death. Throughout the proceedings, the judge maintained a steady and impartial presence, ensuring that legal protocols were observed and that the jury was guided in understanding the complex interplay of evidence, psychology, and law. Jury instructions carefully delineated the standards for evaluating intent, culpability, and mitigating circumstances, recognizing the unique considerations inherent in juvenile cases. The defense highlighted Jason's expressed remorse and willingness to engage in therapeutic programs, positioning him as a candidate for rehabilitation rather than purely punitive measures. They argued that a sentence emphasizing treatment could better serve both Jason and society by addressing the underlying causes of his behavior. In response, the prosecution cautioned that leniency must be balanced against public safety and the rights of victims. They stressed that the gravity of the offense demanded a firm response to deter similar conduct and uphold the rule of law. Witnesses from the community and family members provided additional perspectives. Some testified to the long-standing tensions within the Miller household, lending credence to the defense's depiction of a fraught family environment. Others expressed concern about the impact of the assault on the broader neighborhood, underscoring the ripple effects of such violence. As the trial progressed, the courtroom atmosphere oscillated between clinical analysis and emotional gravity. Moments of factual exposition were punctuated by personal testimony and expert interpretation, weaving a complex tapestry of human experience and legal judgment. Closing arguments crystallized the opposing positions. The defense implored the jury to weigh Jason's youth, psychological challenges, and potential for rehabilitation, urging empathy and consideration of the circumstances that led to the incident. "This is a young life at a crossroads," Attorney Reynolds concluded. "Our justice system must reflect both accountability and hope." The prosecution's closing reaffirmed the seriousness of the crime and the necessity of upholding societal standards. Justice for the victim and community demands that violence, regardless of the perpetrator's age, be met with appropriate consequences, Mitchell asserted. "We must protect the innocent and affirm the law." As deliberations commenced, the courtroom settled into a somber silence. The fate of the teenager and the balance between justice and mercy resting in jurors' hands. The trial's unfolding had exposed the intricate challenges of adjudicating juvenile violence, where legal principles intersect with psychological realities and societal values. Jason Miller's composure remained steady, though the weight of the moment was palpable. The proceedings had laid bare the complexity of his circumstances, the turbulence of his home life, the fractures in his psyche, and the stark consequences of a single violent night. The courtroom bore witness not only to a legal contest, but to a profound human tragedy, where the lines between victim and offender blurred amid the shadows of youthful turmoil. The jury's verdict, delivered after hours of deliberation, cast a heavy pall over the courtroom, the weight of the decision settling with an undeniable finality. Jason Miller, the 16-year-old at the center of this legal maelstrom, stood to hear the judgment that would irrevocably alter the course of his life. The tension, palpable from the outset, crescendoed into a moment of profound solemnity as the foreperson rose to announce the outcome. Guilty of aggravated assault with a deadly weapon. The teenager's composure, maintained with stoic determination throughout the trial, faltered visibly as the words echoed in the chamber. For the first time, the reality of the consequence that extended well beyond the immediate sentence, dawned with stark clarity. His eyes, once defiant, now brimmed with a mixture of despair and disbelief. The hope for acquittal or leniency extinguished in that instant. The sentencing hearing that followed was marked by an atmosphere of gravity and reflection. The presiding judge, cognizant of the appellant's youth and the complex psychological and familial factors presented during the trial, nonetheless underscored the severity of the offense and the necessity of upholding the rule of law. The decision to impose a sentence of life without parole for a juvenile offender was delivered with a measured solemnity that acknowledged the irrevocability of the outcome. This court recognizes the challenges inherent in adjudicating cases involving juvenile defendants, the judge stated, voice steady but tinged with somberness. However, the nature of the crime, the extent of harm inflicted, and the evidence presented compel this court to impose the maximum sentence permissible under the law. Jason's defense team expressed shock and dismay, their arguments for rehabilitation and leniency rendered moot by the jury's verdict and the judge's ruling. Attorney Michael Reynolds, addressing the courtroom in the wake of sentencing, conveyed a restrained yet palpable sense of loss. The decision marks a tragic juncture for a young life burdened by circumstances beyond his control, he remarked. We remain committed to pursuing every viable avenue of appeal in the hope of securing justice tempered by mercy. The prosecution, by contrast, articulated a sense of vindication, emphasizing the imperative of accountability and community safety. Assistant State's Attorney Karen Mitchell highlighted the precedent set by the sentence, underscoring its deterrent value. This verdict affirms that violent acts, regardless of the perpetrator's age, will be met with the full measure of justice. Mitchell declared, it sends a clear message that society will not tolerate such conduct. The courtroom's atmosphere was imbued with a complex mixture of emotions, relief, sorrow, and unresolved tension, reflecting the multifaceted nature of the case. Observers noted the visible strain on Jason's family, whose support had been unwavering despite the unfolding tragedy. Marianne Miller, present throughout the proceedings, appeared physically drained, her grief compounded by the finality of the sentence. As Jason was escorted from the courtroom to begin his incarceration, the stark reality of a life without parole loomed, a punitive measure rare in juvenile cases, but deemed appropriate here due to the severity of the assault and its ramifications. The teenager, once full of youthful promise, now faced an existence confined within institutional walls, his future circumscribed by a sentence that offered no prospect of freedom or reintegration. The sentencing ignited immediate discourse among legal professionals, child advocates, and community leaders, provoking critical examination of juvenile justice policies. Debates centered on the appropriateness of life without parole for minors, the potential for rehabilitation, and the ethical considerations of imposing such irrevocable sentences on developing individuals. Advocacy groups decried the decision as emblematic of systemic failures to address the underlying causes of juvenile delinquency, including mental health challenges, family dysfunction, and social marginalization. Calls for reform gained momentum, urging legislative bodies to reconsider statutes governing juvenile sentencing, emphasizing restorative justice, and therapeutic interventions over purely punitive approaches. Conversely, proponents of stringent sentencing argued that public safety and justice for victims must remain paramount. They contended that certain offenses necessitate unequivocal consequences, irrespective of the offender's age, to uphold societal norms and deter future violence. Within the correctional system, Jason's placement in a juvenile detention facility marked the commencement of a journey fraught with psychological and physical challenges. Reports from correctional staff painted a picture of a young individual grappling with the isolation and harsh realities of confinement. His interactions with peers and staff were often marked by withdrawal and guardedness, reflective of the trauma and uncertainty inherent in such an environment. Mental health professionals attached to the institution noted Jason's ongoing struggles with depression and anxiety, conditions exacerbated by the loss of autonomy and separation from family. Therapeutic interventions were initiated, though their efficacy remained contingent upon the resources available and the constraints of the correctional setting. The appellant's realization that the appeal process would be arduous and uncertain further compounded his distress. Legal counsel prepared for the complex and protracted efforts required to challenge the sentence, cognizant of the uphill battle posed by prevailing legal standards and precedents. Public reaction to the case was polarized. Media coverage highlighted the tragic dimensions of Jason's life and the severity of the crime, prompting widespread discussion about juvenile justice, mental health, and the capacity for reform. Community forums and advocacy events proliferated, reflecting a society grappling with the balance between punishment and rehabilitation. The tragedy of Jason Miller's life lay not only in the violent act he committed, but in the irrevocable trajectory imposed by the justice system. His confinement to life without parole symbolized the ultimate forfeiture of freedom, a stark reminder of the high stakes entwined with juvenile crime. Legal scholars and practitioners continued to dissect the case, examining its implications for future juvenile sentencing and the potential for systemic change. The Miller case became a reference point in debates about the ethical and practical dimensions of life without parole for minors, highlighting the tensions between justice, mercy, and societal protection. Within the walls of the juvenile detention facility, Jason's days unfolded in a routine marked by regimented schedules and limited freedoms. The psychological toll of incarceration weighed heavily, his youthful years consumed within confines that offered scant hope for redemption or release. The weight of the sentence settled heavily in the courtroom as the teenager struggled to process the finality of his fate. The once vibrant contours of a life filled with potential were now overshadowed by the reality of confinement, a life sentence that irrevocably severed ties to normalcy and freedom. The case, while closed in legal terms, remained open in the collective conscience, a somber reflection on the challenges of juvenile justice and the enduring quest to reconcile accountability with compassion. The verdict and sentence handed down in the Jason Miller case reverberated far beyond the confines of the courtroom, igniting a fervent debate over the principles and practices governing juvenile sentencing across the nation. The decision to impose life without parole on a 16-year-old juvenile offender exposed deep fissures within the justice system and challenged prevailing notions about punishment, rehabilitation, and the rights of youth. Community leaders, legal scholars, and advocacy organizations swiftly mobilized in response to the case, recognizing it as emblematic of broader systemic issues. Public forums convened to dissect the implications, drawing diverse voices from victims' rights proponents to mental health experts and juvenile justice reform advocates. The discourse illuminated the tension between the desire for accountability and the recognition of adolescents' developmental vulnerabilities. Advocacy groups argued passionately that the Miller case underscored the urgent need to reform sentencing laws that fail to adequately consider the psychological and social contexts of juvenile offenders. They emphasized that adolescents possess unique capacities for change and rehabilitation, capacities that are often stifled by harsh, irrevocable sentences such as life without parole. These organizations called for legislative action to abolish or severely limit such sentences for minors, advocating instead for alternatives grounded in treatment, education, and restorative justice. Mental health professionals contributed to the dialogue by highlighting the critical role of trauma-informed care in juvenile justice. They underscored how untreated psychological distress, family dysfunction, and socioeconomic disadvantages converge to increase the risk of offending behavior among youth. The case of Jason Miller became a poignant illustration of the consequences when these factors remain unaddressed until intervention occurs through the punitive mechanisms of the legal system. Legal experts examined the constitutional challenges posed by sentencing juveniles to life without parole, particularly in light of evolving jurisprudence. Landmark Supreme Court decisions had begun to recognize the developmental differences between juveniles and adults, ruling that mandatory life without parole for minors violated constitutional protections against cruel and unusual punishment. However, the Miller case revealed the persistent application of such sentences in various jurisdictions, prompting calls for clearer legislative mandates and judicial guidelines. Community organizations also focused on prevention and early intervention strategies, advocating for increased investment in social services, mental health support, and family-centered programs. They argued that addressing the root causes of juvenile delinquency before escalation to serious offenses was essential to breaking cycles of violence and incarceration. The media coverage surrounding the case amplified these conversations, bringing the issue into public consciousness and influencing policymakers. Editorials, investigative reports, and opinion pieces dissected the complexities of juvenile justice, challenging stereotypes of young offenders and humanizing their struggles. The narrative shifted from one solely about crime and punishment to a broader consideration of social responsibility and systemic reform. At the local level, the case galvanized efforts to enhance collaboration between schools, social services, and law enforcement in identifying at-risk youth and providing comprehensive support. Initiatives aimed at mental health screening, conflict resolution, and family counseling gained traction, reflecting a community's resolve to prevent tragedies akin to the Miller incident. However, the discourse was not without contention. Some community members and officials expressed concern that leniency toward juvenile offenders might undermine public safety and fail to deliver justice for victims. They cautioned against reforms perceived as overly permissive, advocating for balanced approaches that protect communities while offering pathways to rehabilitation. The Miller family, while grappling with their own grief and loss, became inadvertent symbols in this broader societal reckoning. Their experience highlighted the human costs entwined with legal decisions and the ripple effects that extend beyond individual lives. Marianne Miller's statements in public forums conveyed both sorrow and a nuanced understanding of the systemic challenges at play, underscoring the need for compassion alongside justice. In academic and policy circles, the case spurred research into the efficacy of juvenile sentencing practices, recidivism rates, and the psychological outcomes of incarcerated youth. Findings increasingly supported the premise that rehabilitative models yield better long-term results for both individuals and society, informing recommendations for legislative and procedural reforms. The debate also touched upon the ethical dimensions of sentencing juveniles to life without parole, a sentence that irrevocably removes the possibility of reintegration and redemption. Philosophical discussions questioned the morality of condemning adolescents, whose identities and capacities are still evolving, to permanent confinement. These considerations added depth to legal and policy deliberations. Advocacy efforts extended to the appellate process, where Jason Miller's legal team pursued avenues to challenge the sentence. While the path was fraught with obstacles, the case became a catalyst for broader campaigns seeking to overturn similar sentences and promote alternatives rooted in juvenile rehabilitation principles. In the correctional environment, the case prompted calls for enhanced mental health services, educational programs, and support systems tailored to juvenile inmates. Recognizing the unique needs of youth serving long sentences, reformers emphasized the importance of creating environments conducive to growth and transformation. Even within the constraints of incarceration, the Miller case thus served as a fulcrum for examining the intersection of law, psychology, and social justice. It illuminated the complexities of holding juveniles accountable while acknowledging their potential for change and the profound impact of environmental factors on behavior. As discussions continued, the case influenced legislative agendas, with some states moving to restrict or eliminate life without parole sentences for minors. National organizations advocated for comprehensive juvenile justice reform, seeking to align policies with contemporary scientific understanding and human rights standards. The legacy of the case extended beyond legal statutes into the cultural consciousness, fostering empathy and awareness about the challenges faced by troubled youth. It spurred educational campaigns aimed at destigmatizing mental health issues and promoting community-based support networks. Ultimately, the repercussions of the Miller case underscored the imperative for a justice system that balances accountability with compassion, recognizes the developmental realities of adolescence, and invests in prevention and rehabilitation. The conversations it ignited continue to shape the evolving landscape of juvenile justice reform, reflecting society's ongoing struggle to reconcile the demands of justice with the hope for redemption and change. Years after the courtroom's final echoes had faded, the case of Jason Miller lingered as a somber testament to the complexities and enduring challenges of juvenile justice. Within the sterile confines of the juvenile detention facility where he now resided, the teenager, once brimming with tentative hope, faced the stark reality of a future indefinitely confined behind bars. The personal toll of incarceration weighed heavily, manifesting in moments of profound isolation and reflection that underscored the tragedy of a life interrupted. Psychological evaluations conducted during his confinement revealed a persistent struggle with depression and anxiety, conditions exacerbated by the loss of freedom and the severing of familial bonds. The institutional environment, with its rigid routines and limited opportunities for meaningful engagement, offered scant solace. For Jason, each day was a reminder of the irrevocable consequences born from a single night of violence and the fractured home that preceded it. Yet, amidst the bleakness, there remained flickers of resilience and self-awareness. Correspondence exchanged with legal counsel and mental health professionals indicated a gradual, if tentative, grappling with responsibility and remorse. Jason articulated a dawning understanding of the profound impact of his actions, not only on his victim and family, but on his own shattered prospects. "I wish I could turn back time," he wrote in one letter, the words heavy with regret. "But all I can do now is try to be better, even if it's behind these walls." The appeal process, arduous and fraught with legal complexities, unfolded over years. While initial petitions were met with resistance, citing the severity of the crime and legal precedents, evolving jurisprudence on juvenile sentencing introduced a cautious optimism. Advances in neuroscience and shifts in societal attitudes towards adolescent culpability provided grounds for reconsideration, though the path remained uncertain and protracted. Outside the walls of confinement, the Miller case continued to resonate within public discourse. It became a catalyst for ongoing debates about the ethical and practical dimensions of sentencing juveniles to life without parole. Lawmakers, activists, and scholars engaged in vigorous discussions about the balance between public safety, justice for victims, and the potential for rehabilitation and redemption inherent in youth. Community initiatives emerged, aimed at addressing the root causes illuminated by the case: family dysfunction, mental health crises, and social marginalization. Programs focused on early intervention, trauma-informed care, and support for at-risk youth sought to prevent the recurrence of tragedies akin to Jason's. The case underscored the necessity of a holistic approach to juvenile justice, one that transcended punitive measures to embrace healing and restoration. For Jason's family, the aftermath was a landscape of enduring pain and reflection. Marianne Miller spoke candidly in interviews about the complexities of love, loss, and the limits of parental influence. Her narrative was one of sorrow intertwined with a cautious hope that the system might evolve to better serve families like hers. Robert Miller's recovery, both physical and emotional, remained a testament to resilience, though the scars, visible and invisible, persisted. The broader societal implications of the case spurred legislative reforms in some jurisdictions, with laws amended to limit the use of life without parole sentences for juveniles and to enhance rehabilitative services within detention facilities. These changes reflected a growing recognition of the developmental science underpinning adolescent behavior and the moral imperatives of justice. Yet, the case also highlighted the enduring tensions and contradictions within the juvenile justice system, a system striving to reconcile the demands of accountability with the nuances of human development and social context. The Miller case served as a cautionary exemplar of the consequences when those complexities are inadequately addressed. Within the institutional setting, efforts to provide educational and therapeutic programs for Jason and similarly situated youth represented incremental progress. These initiatives aim to foster personal growth, emotional regulation, and skills necessary for eventual reintegration, should the legal framework permit. The recognition of the potential for change amid confinement underscored a shift towards more compassionate and evidence-based approaches. Jason's journey, marked by loss and constrained opportunity, also illuminated broader questions about society's capacity for forgiveness and transformation. His story challenged the binary notions of guilt and innocence, punishment and mercy, compelling a more nuanced understanding of justice that embraces complexity and humanity. As years passed, the weight of incarceration and the absence of freedom shaped Jason's identity and prospects in profound ways. The psychological and emotional scars of the episode and its aftermath remained, even as he sought meaning and purpose within the confines imposed upon him. In the end, the narrative of Jason Miller was not solely one of crime and punishment, but a layered chronicle of youth, caught at the crossroads of personal struggle and systemic response. It invited reflection on the efficacy and ethics of juvenile sentencing, the importance of early intervention, and the enduring hope for redemption amidst adversity. The lasting impact of the case extended beyond the individual. to inform ongoing dialogues about how society confronts youth crime, mental health, and the possibility of second chances. It underscored the imperative to design systems that not only adjudicate but also heal, recognizing that the futures of young offenders are inextricably linked to the fabric of community and justice. In this light, Jason Miller's story remains a somber call to action, a reminder of the lives irrevocably altered by violence and the profound responsibility borne by judicial systems, social services, and communities in shaping pathways toward healing and hope.